dive into more, okay, so what do we do in that second session? And then the third one is a little more nuts and bolts of a session of student choir. I really believe all three will be beneficial to you, so I really hope, I know there's a ton of choices that you can make, but I hope you'll come back and see how it all fits together. But, so why this topic of millennials? By the way, does everyone have a handout? It looks very detailed. If you want to be the blank police, as one of my pastors called it, you can fill in the blanks as we go along, and hopefully that'll help you stay engaged a little bit more. There's a lot there, and we'll see. I think we'll be able to cover it, but let's roll in, okay? So why this topic? Well, I think there's several. For me personally, I am technically considered a millennial. But that doesn't make me an expert, so I need to say that from the outset, okay? I'm also an interested conductor. I'm a teacher. I'm a leader of millennials at my university. I'm a mentor to many millennials. We meet regularly. We talk about different topics, issues, their life, what's happening after college. And what I find is that I'm concerned. At the end of the day, with all that I hear and what I see from students, I'm just concerned about their well-being, their future, certain patterns that I've observed. But perhaps for you, maybe you are wanting to start a youth choir, or maybe you have one and you're kind of feeling something's different about my students. I don't know. Maybe this is you. Maybe you want to have one and want to know students better. You want to engage with them perhaps, maybe in a deeper level, or know more about what's going on with your millennials and teenagers. And we're going to talk about millennials, teenagers. How do those intersect? Perhaps you have teenage children, people that are maybe moving out of adolescence, they're moving into young adulthood, and perhaps you're a mentor to some as well. Or maybe you want to be, but aren't sure how do I approach these students, what's needed in their lives. I thought to get and perhaps, yes, also, you are concerned. Or I didn't put it up here, maybe you're unsure. Just about the student culture, the millennial culture that's in our society right now. I thought this was really enjoyable for us to maybe wake up this morning. You gotta love millennials.
Oh, yes.
If you've not seen this before.
He sits inside your local coffee shop, sporting a main burning facial hair. Somehow he believes, although he has no job, that by his studies he will be a millionaire. M-I-L-L-E-N-M-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. M-I-L-L-E-N-M-I-A.
If we have millennials in the room, please don't be offended, okay? Don't mind being one of them. You can rise above it.
Instagram with the quote that's inspirational. Hopes to change the world while wearing yoga. With her dreams and knowledge of essential oils. M-I-L-L-E-N-M-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. M-I-L-L-E-N-M-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. 27 years old, trying to make it on their own. Maybe start by leaving your parents home. Maybe we're just wrong. Criticism isn't easy for their ears. They feel like they know most everything. See, they grew up with undeserving confidence, 'cause they got trophies just from participation. M-I-L-L-E-N-M-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. M-I-L-L-E-N-M-I-A-L, gotta love millennials. In a couple of years, we will have to pass the torch. In a couple of years, they will be in charge, and one will be our president. Oh no. M-I-L-L-E-N-M-I-A-L, gotta love millennials.
My father-in-law sent me that a few months ago. It was this early this summer, and I said, he didn't know I was doing this. I said, you need to know, I'm doing a study on millennials, and we are opening with that. So let's talk a little bit just after that lighthearted start this morning. Think about this. How is the current generation that you see, our youngest, or our more recent teenagers, we'll lump them in, or the millennial generation, how are they different from previous generations? What have you observed?
Entitled.
Okay. Someone else?
They're just as tied to their phones and cell phones and can't go anywhere. It seems like they have a bigger string with mom and dad to that phone.
Gotcha. You mean a connectedness through the phone to their parental units?
Can't have a rehearsal without mom wanting to know what's going on.
Yeah, right, okay. Someone else, yeah?
I was going to say about their motivation, you know, I have a brother that's, you know, younger, and I feel like he falls into that, and others like his age, the motivation has to be valid. You know, why am I doing what I'm doing? Whereas all of us maybe just did it because it's the right thing to do, or it's just, you know, we didn't need so much motivation.
I find them really compartmentalized. Just, I mean, I don't see a holistic approach to life with a lot of my kids.
I see. Anybody else see that? Holistic. Come on in. Any other reflections, observations? Well, let's spin this. How are they similar to previous generations? At this age in their life. Those of you, do you remember, say from the, if you're a boomer or if you're a Gen Xer, do you remember this period in your life?
They still need role models.
Okay.
I think they're very cause-oriented, and they get very passionate about things that they care about. And it's the ones that I know, kind of that crusader thing, reminiscent of the 60s.
Yeah, okay.
But very passionate on causes, on energy.
Sure, yeah. Someone else?
Which can also make them fiercely loyal.
I think it's helpful for this second question, and it just kind of hit me in the head when I was working on this. I was asking, we're always focusing on our differences. But I think for us and what we do, it's helpful if we just pause and think, okay, they're people too. Millennials are people too. Teenagers are people too. And that we sometimes miss the fact that they're going through a stage in their life, that all of us have gone through that age bracket. But I think what we'll see is the context is different. The context in which they're living those years has changed. The context in society and culture is radically different, which we're going to see how that affects the developmental processes of belief systems forming and worldview forming and how they intersect with the world, because the world is so different, right? There's not as many similarities from the earlier generations, say all the way up to Gen X, and then things really started looking different for the first time for a generation, unlike previous generations before. So here's where we're going. With that discussion in mind, with some of this as by way of introduction, we're going to look at some research sources. I'm going to bring some information to you today. And with that, we're going to put just a quick snapshot together of, okay, here's what looks like, here's the description, here's a quick picture of a millennial from some of the resources I'm going to mention. I think this makes us pause and take a reality check. We're going to talk just briefly about that. And then from another resource, we're going to look at some really specific perspective viewpoints on these aspects of adolescent or millennial culture from another resource. I would show you these books I'm going to talk about in a minute. They're propping up our projector, so I'll go back and get them shortly. So that's where we're going, and these research sources are really, really helpful, and I challenge you, if you've not heard of these, to go get them. If you want to work with students, with millennials, you want to know more. This recent one by Tom and Jess Rayner. Tom is President CEO of Lifeway Christian Resources. His son Jess. It's called The Millenials. It's the top book right there on the shelf. Jess is a student, is a administrative pastor. Here it is. And like I said, Tom is at Lifeway. He's been there, I think, since like 708. And what they did here, they did 1,200 different interviews with an intent of finding out more about millennial culture, millennial life. They wanted to study them professionally, personally, spiritually. And from their study, they get some really great insights on family, money, media, workplace, environment, religion, all these different things. It's a very investigative look, and it's from a Christian worldview, so I think it's a really, really good read. This book, Chap Clark's Hurt 2.0, he has a first edition of this, which is just called Hurt, Inside the World of Today's Teenagers. That was from 2004. Then he followed it up with addendums and changes and some new information in 2011. And I would challenge you to go get this book. It is very, very insightful. Chap's the professor of youth, family, and culture in the School of Theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. His PhD, he's been there since '97, PhD from the University of Denver. Here's Hurt 2.0, this book right here. Great resource. I'm going to be pulling from these resources today, which is why I want you to see what we're looking at. And then various articles from the Pew Research Center. Looked at there's so much information here. We're really going to skim the surface, but there's information out there you can search to find out some trends, some statistics, and we're going to look at some of those numbers just to, I think it gives us a little bit of more precision to our understanding of the millennial culture. So, this snapshot, and I'm going to have some audience participation here in a minute. Get these out. Who are the millennials? Well, Rayner says they're born 1980 to 2000. The Pew Research Center in 2015 said they were people ages 18 to 34. There's a little bit of discrepancy. Maybe you've seen this, maybe not. This is how the generations are kind of broken down based on research from the Pew Research Center. I hope you can see that. They're America's largest generation now. They have surpassed the boomers, 78 million plus. And look at this graph, which is really kind of, if we look at the silent, the boomer, the Gen X generation, and the millennial generation, seeing how the population's moving, trends, most likely 2015. This is really sad. When you see a generation go away, right? And then you see boomers, and then as time is going on. They're very diverse, from both in terms of ethnicity, culture, background, race. It's very difficult to kind of get a stereotype for this generation because they are so diverse. There's this, for instance, there's a unique thing right now in the millennial culture of mixed race and ethnicity adoptions. I don't know if you've heard about this, but there's just an increase in this, and it's really, that affects culture in a unique way. It produces great diversity. They do want to make a contribution. There's a desire with a cause that they want to champion. They aren't as narcissistic, and don't be offended, but as the research would say, narcissistic is maybe the boomer generation, or is maybe as self-absorbed as some research would show maybe the boomer generation to be. They're very educated, very educated. 4 out of 5 older millennials received education beyond high school. 1 out of 4 graduated from college, and currently 1 out of 4 is in college. And they are working, despite what you've heard or kind of your sense in your circle. 50% of millennials are currently working. And then they're not married overall. In 2011, the Millennials study by Rayner, 1 out of 4 were married, while most are not married. Most do plan to have children, though. And 1 out of 10 said they plan to have no children. Now here I want to pause and try to make a point of clarification, sort of. Are today's current teenagers considered millennials? The answer is, well, unclear. Let's look at it. PRC, the Pew Research Center, they cite the birth range as being 81 to 97. The Millennials study cites it as 80 to 2000. That is a little more accurate in terms of a generation gap of 20 years. Okay? That's a little more standard. Think about this. Current teenagers, right now, if someone's 13 or 18, they've been teenagers since 2011 to 2016. That means they were born in 98 to 2003. So you see, they're straddling the gap here. Some are on the end of the millennials, and some have passed this 2000 marker. They certainly passed it if you use the PRC date ranges. So we're kind of in a middle spot right now in terms of generational gaps. There is this move of calling, what are my kids, Generation Z. Some have used this term I generation. That's coming out. But the problem is you can't study a generation while you're in the middle of it. You can, but you can't get an exact picture of who they are because they haven't fully gone through, there's not been that full, say, 20-year gap. There's no official dates yet. For instance, some say for the Generation Z, they were born mid-90s to early 2000s. Some research says 94 to 2010, very fixed dates. Some say anyone born after 2001. So it's a little blurry when we try to nail down, if you're looking at your current teenagers and then also millennial culture. What we can say is that if you've been interacting with any millennials over the past 5 years and that were teenagers, there's a culture there that they've come up in. And that millennial culture is still there and is still out there for current teenagers that are a part of that. If you're interested, we could spend a lot of time on this. If you want to do some follow-up, there's a marketing agency that did a study on Generation Z from a marketing standpoint. So how to reach, how to target, how to sell things to Generation Z. Might be interesting on your time. And this is what it says: forget everything you learned about millennials. So I looked at the study. I looked at the presentation. Very insightful, again, from a marketing, very secularistic standpoint, but eye-opening. I'm going to try to spend more time on what I think are similarities between these two. And you'll hear me talk about millennials and teenagers pretty much interchangeably. Okay? The 6 living generations in America. There was a study by Dr. Novak from University of Phoenix it's online. It's down here, by the way. And I put it in your handout with the resources page. It's an article from a marketing standpoint. And she goes through and reads and lists these characteristics of the generations for marketers. How do you reach them? What are their tendencies? What are they like? And I want us to pause, and she's going to talk about, and I'm going to actually have you, she gives us generation, what she calls Y, or we're thinking millennials, and then Generation Z. Would somebody be willing to just read? How about millennials? Generation Z, anyone? All right. Give us that snapshot that she provides from her resource here, her research.
Generation Y millennial. Born between 1981 and 2000, aka the 9/11 generation. Echo boomers, America's next great generation, brings a sharp departure from Generation X. They are nurtured by omnipresent parents, optimistic and focused, respect authority, falling crime rates, falling teen pregnancy rates, but with school safety problems, they have to live with the thought that they could be shot at school. They learned early that the world is not a safe place. They schedule everything. They feel enormous academic pressure. They feel like a generation and have great expectations for themselves. Prefer digital literacy as they grew up in a digital environment. Have never known a world without computers. They get all their information and most of their socialization from the internet. Prefer to work in teams. With unlimited access to information, tend to be assertive with strong views. Envision the world as a 24/7 place. Want fast and immediate processing. They have been told over and over again that they are special, and they expect the world to treat them that way. They do not live to work. They prefer a more relaxed work environment with a lot of hand-holding and accolades.
All right, Generation Z.
Born after 2001. In 2006, there were a record number of births in the U.S., and 49% of those born were Hispanic. This will change the American melting pot in terms of behavior and culture. The number of births in 2006 far outnumbered the start of the baby boom generation, and they will easily be a larger generation. Since the early 1700s, the most common last name in the U.S. was Smith, but not anymore. Now it is Rodriguez. That's interesting. There are two age groups right now, tweens. They are aged 8 to 12 years old, and there will be an estimated 29 million tweens by 2009. $51 billion is spent by tweens every year, with an additional $170 billion spent by their parents and family members directly for them. Toddler and elementary school age, 61% of children ages 8 through 17 have televisions in their rooms. 35% have video games. 14% have a DVD player. 4 million will have their own cell phones. They have never known a world without computers and cell phones. They have eco-fatigue. They are actually tired of hearing about the environment and the many ways we have to save it. With the advent of computers and web-based learning, children leave behind toys at younger and younger age. It's called KGOY, Kids Growing Older Younger. And many companies have suffered because of it. Most recognizable is Mattel, the maker of Barbie dolls. In the 1990s, the average age of a child in their target market was 10 years old. And in 2000, it dropped to 3 years. As children reach the age of 4 and 5, old enough to play on the computer, they become less interested in toys and begin to desire electronics, such as cell phones and video games. They are savvy consumers, and they know what they want, how to get it, and they are oversaturated with brands.
All right, so that's a perspective from some of the research. Let's look at this research, Tom Rainer's book, Inside the Millennials. We're going to look at the co-author, the actual millennial who's helping Tom write, his son Jess. He offers this really succinct perspective on what is my generation like, talking about the millennial generation. Several bullet points we're going to throw up here real fast. We want a connected family. We want parental involvement. We are diverse. We believe we can make an impact on the world. This is interesting. 9 out of 10 believe it's their responsibility to make a difference in the world. And 3 out of 4 believe it's their role to serve others. We are not workaholics. Interesting. Balance between work and life is a #1 factor in job selection. They want to grow in their chosen field, but they want to be on their way to making a mark in the world as well, which might not be in that current job. We want a mentor. Think Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great. That's a stream of mentorship there. 3 out of 4 would like a leader to come beside them and teach them leadership skills. Millennials are teachable. 40% of adult millennials have a mentor in their lives. We are green, but not that green. They're trying to reverse the trends of previous generations, but it's not the ultimate hill to die on. We communicate unlike any other generation. 7 out of 10 say the cell phone is vital to their lives. This is interesting. They're financially confused. There's so many choices now in terms of financial stability. 7 out of 10 think they should turn to the government and believe that government should provide their retirement. So they're getting conflicting and they're getting confusing answers on financially related questions. And this for us is the most troubling. We're not religious. It's the least religious generation in modern American history. There are spiritual people that 3 out of 4 would claim spirituality, but not religious. Most cannot define their religious beliefs, and they are not involved with an established religion. 65% of millennials do not regularly attend worship services, and 1 out of 5 is in some sort of small group Bible study. Rainer, on his blog, tomrainer.com, gives this really interesting snapshot specifically for the local church. and how millennials are shaping local congregations. Let's think about these. Many of them are attracted to smaller venues. Think about the churches that are launching satellite campuses. That is an incredibly high trend. They see culture as something to influence, not an enemy. They want to have a missionary mindset. If you're not interested in reaching your community, most likely they're not going to be interested in you as well. If your church is kind of competitive with the church down the street. Number 3, they like to cooperate with others. They abhor worship wars. And they love churches that love their communities. One of the first questions a millennial might ask a church leader is, what's the church doing to influence or impact and minister to the surrounding community? They're attracted to churches that emphasize groups. They want to be a part of a congregation that is a healthy small group, Sunday school class, home groups, or however you want to describe that. Interesting though, they want to be trained on their schedule. So if all these churches just have Sunday morning groups, that's not, they want to have that access more varied, maybe during the week, maybe in the evening. Even, as strange as this is, maybe, forms of video training, okay? They will question, this might annoy us, they question almost everything. And church, they want to know, again, the question, why? And if the answer is we've always done it this way, that's not enough. They're slow to join, but they're slow to leave. Sometimes church leaders are frustrated as how it takes a millennial age person that long to commit to a place. But if they want to commit and they finally make that choice, then most likely they really believe it's something they want to be a part of and will stay. And they want to be involved. If a church does not have an intentional plan to get millennials involved in ministry quickly, they will not reach millennials, Rayner says. I think this is very important for us to have this in our mind as we think how this in fact impacts what we do or may be doing in youth choirs. Now I'm going to pull some things from the Pew Research Center, just some quick stats. 5 facts about America's students, an article from, or a study from 2015. Just a few of these that I'm going to mention, only 3. As a whole, we mentioned that America's K-12 students are more racially diverse than ever. And they're more likely to stay in school. Look at this breakdown of races: Hispanic, Black, non-Hispanic, white. And look at this, this is the dropout rate. It's going down in all ways, which is good. I think that's a good, healthy sign. Millennials are on track to be the most educated generation. Look at this. This is fascinating. The percentage completing at least a bachelor's degree at ages 18 to 33. Men, women. And the percentage of their generation. Both men and women. Highest percentage of anyone getting a bachelor's degree than previous 3 generations. And I think this is interesting too. You compare more men than women getting degrees from what is called the silent generation. More boomers, men than women. And then it changes here in the Gen X generation. More women start to get bachelor's degrees, which I think is a really good sign. And then the millennials. Think about this though. Now, how do millennials compare with their grandparents? I thought this was a really interesting article, comparing and contrasting these two. A few points that jump out. These aren't loaded statements. Just take the research for what it is. Millennials are much better educated than the silent generation. Millennials 4 times as likely to have a bachelor's degree than their grandparents, grandmothers. Men, 21% of millennial men versus 12%. Interesting. A greater share of millennial women have a bachelor's degree than their male counterparts, which we just mentioned. That's a reversal. Millennials, 27 versus 21%. We saw that on the graph. Silent gen, women were 5% less likely. There's some interesting statistics here, I think. Young women today are much more likely to be working compared to silent generation women during their young adult years. For instance, millennial women, 63% are employed and 31% are not in the workforce. And silent generation women at that time, 38% versus 59%. See a reversal. Millennials today, we talked about not being married, are twice as likely to have never married as silents when they were young. 68% of millennials have never been married. This is from the Pew Research article. We mentioned a different stat earlier. 1963, women married at 21, men married at 23. Now that trend, as you probably have seen, is moving back. In 2014, women were getting married at age 27, so they're getting married later. I've seen that trend. Young silent men in 1963, this is interesting, were 10 times more likely to be veterans, which would make sense. 3% of millennials are vets versus 35%. That's just interesting, I think, to know. See the difference in the generations there. I think this is interesting. Millennial rating, Pew Research Center, their rating of news, media, religious organizations declines. Look at the other generations over time, 2010 to 2015, thinking that this has a positive effect on the way things are going in our country. Millennials are the ones that think it's going down here in terms of churches and religious organizations. National news media, generally there's kind of a downward spin, but look at this, how stark that is. Millennials thinking that news media has a positive effect on the way things are going in our country. A difference between 2010 to 2015.
Wow.
But they think some things have a positive effect on the society. Banks, large corporations, labor unions, small businesses. But look, most all of the generations think there's an upward spin, though. But generally, millennials in these three categories, this top one here, it's a higher percentage of their generation than the other generations. Percentage, not actual people, but the percentage of the population of these generations. A comparison, 2010 to 2015. I think all of this forces us to have a reality check, which you've probably had, we mentioned earlier, that the context for the generation, as quickly as we try to kind of set some things, is very different. It's unlike any time prior. It really, I think we could say, probably began in the 60s. This is a whole study could be done here. And it was a culture shift that had directly affected organization structures involved with our youth, which in turn indirectly affected the processes developmentally for our youth in terms of their psyche, their inner security, their sense of the world. Our students now have come up in a very different culture, and it changed drastically in the 60s. Just consider that for a minute. It is a different time. You might disagree with that, but there's plenty of research that would say you're wrong. And this one is probably the most significant piece of research, I think, is Chap Clark's book, Hurt 2.0. What he does, and we'll spend the rest of the time talking about this, he dives in to adolescent culture. What does he do? He goes out, Dr. Clark goes to a school in Los Angeles County, and he spends a year doing a qualitative, not quantitative, based on numbers, surveys, and things. He lives as a substitute teacher with the students for that school year. Interviews, talks, conversations in the lunchroom, in the hallways, talking with teachers. It's considered this ethnographic study. And it's more social research. It's a very interactive process. And what he does is he comes away from all this interaction, he gets a snapshot of how our students view certain issues like sexuality, busyness, family, peers, and relationships, and many other things. We don't have time to look at all of them, but we're going to look at just a few of them. He avoids looking at some very controversial or those issues that divide or segment students, or those things like maybe drug use that are more complex, or eating disorders, abuse, rape, things that are a little more provocative. He states that those kinds of issues only make sense when you look at the broader culture, which he's trying to look at. And it's a fabulous snapshot. I really encourage you to get this. And his whole premise is this. The key contributor to our current mid-adolescent, he defines this period, 14 to 20, is the culture of abandonment. What he's saying is our culture, our society has in essence through the structures, leadership, we have abandoned our adolescents to fend for themselves. Adolescents have been cut off far too long from the adults who've had the power and experience to escort them into the greater society. Adolescents have been abandoned. They have therefore created their own world, a world that is designed to protect them from the destructive forces and wiles of the community. What we need to realize here, and from his research he'll say, on the surface we see a reaction by our students to disconnect, to silo, to isolate themselves, to avoid making meaningful connections. But that's because they don't want to be hurt. They've been hurt too long. They've been neglected or perceived some lack of value from other generations before them. What does this have to do with us, youth culture, youth choirs? The better we can understand them, the better we can care for them. And that's what I'm going to submit to you as how you respond to the students that are in your rooms, is know them so that you can care for them. Music is a tool to minister. Some quotes from Dr. Clark. I've attempted an honest look at American teenagers from the inside perspective of their world. I have tested my conclusions with a wide variety of young people across the United States. They have affirmed that this is the most accurate and compassionate observation of their world they have ever received from an adult. One of the students, a junior, says this: tell them our story. Tell them the truth, that nobody cares, that nobody listens, that teachers and coaches and cops and parents don't even know who we are. Tell them that and see if anybody listens. Ha! Not a chance. Dr. Clark says, most of us want to take the easy route of claiming that adolescence hasn't changed since we were in high school. Others say it really doesn't matter if adults understand kids, as long as the young live up to adult values of respect, commitment, and hard work. Still, others fall into the category. If you can't understand them, join them. After years of study and conversations with countless adults, there is a gnawing, nagging reality that even though we may want to be committed to being a light to our young, we often have no idea what we are dealing with. So what are some of the things they are dealing with? Can we figure out this question here? What are we dealing with? Well, let's look at a few of them. Just a few things that I think are really troubling, but important for us to know if we want to really intersect and really engage with the students that are in our choirs. For this aspect, Dr. Clark said this was the easiest one to get the students to talk about. 4 things jumped out that are unique to this culture, the students, in terms of their view of school and busyness. And that is this, that the attitude towards teachers and the respect that they deserve has changed. Students believe it's no longer something to be earned. It's something to be granted. It's something to be earned. Okay? Teachers must earn the students' respect by showing them respect first. They are prepared not to respect a teacher unless the teacher wins their respect. Whether we think that's right or wrong, that's the reality. That's the reality check. Now think about it. There's a fundamental change in society. It used to be, if a student was in trouble, the parent went in and said, what did my child do? Generally now, it's going in, what did you do to my child? That's a fundamental reversal of responsibility. This motivation behind academic achievement. Students are chased by this tyranny of the GPA, right? Of pursuing, keeping that GPA up, scholarships, college, pushing forward, being a success. The motivation for success for students, whether they were high or low achievers, was this: a student will do whatever it takes to navigate the complex and varied demands of mid-adolescence with as much self-protection and self-interest as necessary. This prevalence and morality of cheating, their view on this has changed. Cheating is now considered to be the norm. It's so widespread as part of this relativistic idea in our society. They get mixed messages from parents, from school, imagine that. And there's this lack of clear definition regarding academic dishonesty. This is why universities have academic honesty policies, and there's severe penalties for it. The main idea for students was do whatever to fulfill the expectations of parents and teachers, even if that meant cheating, to get the right grade. Students are experiencing now a high level of anxiety, this competitive environment that's in the classroom. The anxiety sources are parents, teachers, society, and even colleges. There's this requirement of service hours. There's this requirement of extracurricular activity. And if you don't do all these things, you're not as competitive to get into the school you want to go to get into college, or to get whatever scholarship you're wanting. This amount of homework, those of you that have students probably have seen this. In his study, there was about 45 minutes to an hour worth of homework per subject. I mean, that's just incredibly intense. For some that are in athletics, that's 2 hours a day. Maybe extracurricular activities, clubs, churches, or youth group, that's maybe 4 to 5 hours a week. Maybe they're volunteering. Well, you get some typical day that looks like this. Most places, 6 to 6:30, they're up. They get back after practice or a meeting at 5 to 6 p.m. Maybe they get some homework done, grab dinner, again, maybe. Then maybe there's an evening activity for something that's going on. They get home, they've got all that homework, and they're going to bed at 1 o'clock. That is a rough, typical day that he found in his student. And think about how the students are just so frazzled, exhausted. That affects the way they're thinking and the way they're going to engage in the world. What do they see about family? Pause here for a little bit of data from the Pew Research Center. Maybe you sense some changes, you're right. The divorce rate, 2% in 1940, 43% in 2002. In 2008, 67% of children ages 0 to 17 lived with two married parents. That used to be 77% in 1980. This is interesting. 65% of young adults cohabitate at least once prior to marriage. In the 60s, that was 10%. 80% of millennials believe, interestingly, despite all of this, what is troubling, many believe they will only marry once. And they still, though, a good percentage receives advice from their moms and dads. Yes?
Because earlier, what you said before your school busyness
Yes.
section,
Uh-huh.
so I want to know what happened to us
Oh, that's another
that
study.
made our kids
Yeah,
feel like we abandoned them.
yeah.
Because I guess I have the millennials, a 28-year-old
Mm-hmm.
and just about to be 23.
Yeah.
My 28-year-old, maybe I might see a little of that.
Mm-hmm.
But that I'm like, okay, so how do I fit? If
Mm-hmm.
I'm the cause,
Mm-hmm. And you have to consider his study, where he was, but it's a pretty far-reaching study. I think let's keep going, and we might have some of the answers to that questions, to what you're asking there, and some looking at some of the other perspectives.
because I
think-
see, wow, if I made that impression, I
Mhm.
don't think I did that on my children. I don't think my children
Mhm.
necessarily felt that, but some
Sure.
of the things I'm going, oh, okay, yeah. But it's like, so I need to maybe change how some of mine, anyway, okay.
Yeah, and there's always exceptions, of course, to any sort of research. There's outliers, okay, and there's no reason to think you would not be. Let's keep going. Let's see what he says. 25% of people, this was a source he cited, The Way We Were, Never Were, by Stephanie Kuntz. This is interesting, a perspective on family. 25% of people polled in a recent national study, this is from the book when it was published in 2004, and American Morality said that for $10 million, they would abandon their whole family. And many would do it for free. Interesting. How do we define family? This is a hot button topic right now in our society, yes. As he found in his study, and we've seen to overcome in our society, the anything goes. And when he tried to get students to nail down the definition of a family, there was no ability to do that. Any perception of family was considered family. And as we know, two-parent is becoming the exception, not the rule. Students offered some reflections on family. Would you mind reading one? Number 1, would you mind, Chuck? Number 2, number 3, and thank you, sir. Number 4. Here's some students talking about their families. Go ahead.
Jerry lived with her little sister and mother and her mother's latest boyfriend in his house with his 3 kids when they were not at their mother's. Her family was her mother, sister, and the boyfriend, but not his kids.
Number 2.
The man Kim calls dad is actually her mother's former boyfriend. Kim never met her real dad, and she refers to the man she now lives with, her legal stepfather, by his first name. She told me that she does not have a family.
Number 3.
Kara lives with her mother, older sister whose boyfriend occasionally lives with them, and the grandfather of one of her closest friends. The word family is used only to talk about her mother's family, meaning Kara's maternal grandparents, aunts, and uncles.
And number 4.
Sam lives with two moms and has never had a dad. His two moms are his family.
All right. And he offered a few other perspectives, but I just pulled those out so you can kind of sense the students' environments that are coming. That is, again, there's so many varieties of the way family looks now. And what we see is that there's some big influence in students in terms of family and parental behaviors. Parents seem to be fragmented in what he found. They were spending more time keeping their personal lives in order, generally it seemed, from the student's perspective, than caring for their kids. And there was an incredible amount of conflict between students and their parents. Now, this is not a new thing probably in terms of family relationships, but it just seemed to be really heightened because of a strange family structure that they might be in. Most of the conflicts were about trust from the student's perspective. But what he found was really the problem was a change in the dynamic of parenting a teenager. It wasn't actually about an issue. It was just about navigating a change in the relationship that brought on so much conflict. Daily concerns might be part of this, from the clothes the student's wearing to homework, or maybe it's bigger reaching issues like dating, or college, or future things, or grades. This is an interesting trend in terms of family. The percentage of 18 to 34-year-olds by living arrangement. For the first time in history, this was in 2014, the percentage of 18 to 34-year-olds living with their parents is the highest compared to married or cohabitating, living alone, or some other living arrangement. First time, just barely, 32.1 versus 31.6. This is interesting. Young men are now more likely to live with a parent than to live with a spouse or partner. Not so for women. So here's those living in a parent's home, men. And look at the years. And then here's men. You see the spike that reversed in 2014. It's interesting, people's perception of family and how they fit in their family and their role of family. I think it's just enlightening for us to know and have some of this background. There's a lot of conflict in our students' lives, and often it comes from home. What about peers and relationships? Very volatile time. 57% of teenagers have met a new friend over the internet. There's interpersonal relations, but a high percentage now meeting people over the internet. 2/3 of teens have met a friend online. For some teens, there are downsides to social media, though. Maybe they have experienced some sort of drama, some sort of conflict online. This is interesting. More than half of teens have seen postings about something they weren't invited to, okay? Or they felt pressure to post things that make them look good or make them look popular. We know the teenage experience, well, a couple other things, Sarah, before we're going. 88% of teens, you probably could guess, spend time with their friends via text message. And 55 every day. 25% of teens have fought with a friend or something that first happened online or because of a text message. So you've got conflict unfolding on technology. And a lot of this is happening while you're in rehearsal and you don't even know it.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you know it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Chap says this: mid-adolescents believe their only choice is to find a relational place where they are not in danger of being ignored, used, or pushed aside. This is interesting. The development, what he calls the cluster, is not simply a developmental means to an end of preparation for adulthood. It's far more basic. The need for affiliation, support. Think about this in youth choir. The need for affiliation, support, and security during mid-adolescence is fertile ground for intensely powerful peer relationships. What is the cluster that he talks about? It's a little different from the clique, which was a little more, it was smaller than 4 to 5 or 8 to 10, and it was more selective. The cluster, the boundaries are a little bit, can be permeated a little bit more. You might find yourself in multiple clusters, where if you were in a clique, that was your posse, right? But you might find yourself in various clusters. Often they're gender specific, almost always. And this is a mark of adolescence. There's a lot of loyalty. There's a lot of commitment. It's very familial. And there are some rules and norms that are established even non-verbally, kind of how the cluster is going to operate. And they might have a cluster that's involved with band or choir or athletics, and they might be involved in various things. It's a little different, he found, than the clique used to be. Perhaps the most concerning, and this is where we'll end with the last few minutes, is the religion and spirituality. Millennials, and that's filtering down into our teenagers, we said look less to religion and spirituality. 13% from Rainer's book considered any kind of spirituality to be important to their lives. Only 31% of millennials believe in the exclusivity of salvation in Jesus. And it seemed they're generally, we could use the word agnostic to all matters of religion. This issue of faith is so important, especially when we think about youth choir. We can engage our students and meet a need in these areas. We can bring peace, we can bring security, we can bring support. But this piece of faith is important, it's huge for us. We have access to this piece in our choirs that the public schools don't. There's a great book you need to know about called Sticky Faith. Sticky Faith. You notice Chap helped author this one as well. And the idea is, how do we help faith stick in kids? Here's some of the problems that they found in helping kids hold on to their faith. And youth choir can be a place where this can be reinforced, faith ideals. What they found, 12% of mothers and 5% of fathers have regular conversations with their kids about faith. Wow, that's scary. Between 40 and 50% of kids who graduate from a church or youth group will fail to stick with their faith in college. 20% of those who left the faith actually said, you know, I'm going to do that. They plan to. There was another 80% who abandoned it that were not planning to. Scary. They estimate that between 30 and 60% will return in their late 20s. Also, the 40 to 70% who have their faith never return. So, what do they believe? If they believe anything, what are they not sticking with? This new idea in this generation has developed, coined by Dr. Christian Smith from the University of Notre Dame, and I want you to know about it. How many of you have heard this term before? Anyone? Yeah. What is this idea of moralistic therapeutic deism? It's their kind of worldview overall about faith. This is a strange video, I'll admit, as far as how it was produced, but we're going to hear Dr. Smith's colleague, Dr. Dean, talk about what it is.
Moralistic therapeutic deism is, according to this particular study, okay? Kids would believe 5 things. Number 1, God exists, He created and orders the world, watches over life on earth, so they believe God exists. Second, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other. They think this is what most of the world's religions teach. Third, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about yourself. Fourth, God is not involved in my life except when I need God to intervene to help me solve a problem. And then, they're not very complimentary of how well God does this, by the way. And finally, good people go to heaven when they die. Now, after the study came out and had listed these, I did focus groups in my own congregation and to see what kids thought of this. I just wanted to do a reality check. And they were like, well, yeah, this is what is preached in church. I believe this. This is what is true.
I don't understand the music, but whatever.
And the thing that's interesting and what I do with my students is I say, okay, line up this by the Apostles' Creed, you know? Because this looks sort of Christianish on the outside. You can see where people get that confused. But if you line that up by the Apostles' Creed, which is the historic confession of the church, then you suddenly realize, who is the Apostles' Creed about? Well, it's about the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. God. It's about God and what God is doing and who we are in relationship to God. But it's really all about God. Who is moralistic therapeutic deism about? Well, it's all about us. And that's a problem. If what the church is teaching is a gospel that's fundamentally about us instead of about who God is, then we have strayed rather seriously away from the teachings of Christ.
And that's where it ends. Again, strange production of that video, but I thought it'd be nice to hear someone else talk about it. She has a book called Almost Christian, where she unpacks what Dr. Smith had talked about. That's it in a nutshell that she mentioned, if you want to write any of those down. So it's kind of an interesting state of mind, interesting belief system. And I've heard I've seen this in my students, just so you know, I've seen this in students. Maybe you have as well if you get a chance to talk faith through them, about faith to them. So with all that in mind, a lot of numbers, a lot of ideas, a lot of kind of a situation, maybe it feels a little bleak, and I think it should feel that way. Again, it's a reality check. And so the question is then, what do we do? Right. What's our role? I think we have a responsibility. And then how do we engage students through youth choir? What we're going to do is unpack this. I think some really clear ways we can do this. It's not as difficult or strange or as intimidating as you think. We're going to unpack that this afternoon at 2:30, where we talk about the heartbeat of youth choir. I think the heartbeat of a youth choir can respond fully to what we are seeing here, to the research and what we've experienced.